Prepare to have everything you thought you knew about romance completely incinerated. Because the fantasy you hold in your head, the one painted with knights, chivalry, and declarations of undying affection, is a lie. A beautiful, devastatingly sanitized modern myth, and the actual truth of how medieval people saw love is so dark, so disturbing, and so genuinely disgusting that it makes our modern relationship problems look like minor inconveniences on a perfect date. This wasn't the era of finding your soulmate. This was an era where the concept of a 12-year-old being married off as a strategic asset was perfectly normal, where the highest form of love was defined by agonizing, crippling suffering, and where the most powerful institution on earth taught that the simple act of enjoying sex with your own lawful spouse was a literal, damnable sin against God, a stench in the nostrils of the Almighty. And we are going to dive headfirst into the abyss of the medieval heart, uncovering the twisted, often horrifying system of romance that was built on ownership, violence, psychological torture, and a societal framework that systematically crushed any genuine affection, leaving behind a legacy so chilling that many of its toxic ideas, mutated and concealed, still infect our concept of love today, proving that sometimes history's most romantic legends are actually its most terrifying stories. We begin with the most sophisticated form of self-harm ever invented, courtly love, or feinamers, the art of perpetual suffering. Forget the image of a knight winning his lady fair. The entire, exquisitely complex philosophy of courtly love, the very foundation of aristocratic romance from the 11th century onward, was based on the absolute necessity of never getting what you wanted, transforming unfulfillment into the highest spiritual state, a twisted inverse of religious devotion. The object of this refined, obsessive desire, the domina, or lady, was almost always a married, socially superior noblewoman, which was the central, non-negotiable mechanic of the entire system, because it immediately provided the single, most crucial element, an insurmountable obstacle, ensuring the love could never be consummated, and therefore could never be ruined by the squalid reality of marriage. The knight, the lover, was not seeking a relationship. He was seeking an ordeal, dedicating his entire life, his honor, his battles, his very breath to the worship of this distant, unattainable figure, not for her hand, but for the moral and spiritual elevation that his agony provided, proving his worth not by his success, but by the magnificent, crippling scale of his failure. The language of the troubadours, those poets of the south of France who codified this emotional doctrine, is not one of hope, but of exquisite, deliberate pain. They sang about losing sleep, losing appetite, wasting away, and being consumed by a love sickness so potent it was believed to be a genuine, often fatal, medical condition called amour. If the lady showed the knight kindness, he was supposed to become more tormented by his unworthiness. If she ignored him completely, that was proof of her perfect virtue and the nobility of his devotion. A medieval instruction manual for developing an anxiety disorder where the symptoms of depression and stalking were praised as the highest form of virtue, where the lover must be wretched, sleepless, and constantly weeping, or his love simply wasn't real. The lady herself was trapped, expected to be perpetually cold and distant, a marble statue of virtue, because any genuine sign of reciprocation would immediately cheapen the love, transforming it from feinamers pure love into mere folia lust, or folly, thereby destroying the entire spiritual project, making both parties miserable, but in a way that granted them immense social cachet, transforming romantic obsession into an aristocratic performance of sophisticated, lifelong psychological torture, moving from the rarefied air of the noble court down to the stone walls of the castle where life actually happened. We find that the institution of marriage was not a union of hearts, but a business transaction so brutal and mercenary it would make a modern corporate merger blush. Forget romance. Medieval marriage was, at its core, a system of strategic property transfer, debt settlement, and legalized human commerce. The central question a medieval father asked was never, "Will this person make my daughter happy?" but, rather, "How many acres, how many sworn swords, or what critical debt relief comes with this deal?" The dowry system was the brutal engine of this commerce, turning women into living, walking price tags, where the family of the bride had to negotiate, literally, the worth of their daughter in land, livestock, silver, or military resources, a process that stripped the daughter of any individual value and reduced her to an expensive asset being transferred between two male-led houses. Children were not just engaged young, they were often married off in their minority, with binding contracts drawn up for 7-year-olds, not as symbolic gestures, but as ironclad, financially punitive agreements, making it clear that a medieval wedding was not a sacrament of love, but a high-stakes legally enforceable contract designed to secure alliances and political power. The bride, often leaving her home forever to join a strange, sometimes foreign, household, was viewed by her new family and her husband as the merchandised, the dower property, and the potential breeder of male heirs, and, if that merchandise turned out to be defective, if she couldn't produce the desired sons, or if the political alliance failed, there were clauses for annulment, repudiation, or being sent back home in disgrace, making it clear that she was a possession whose value was strictly tied to her utility to the husband's lineage, even for commoners, though less grandly political. Marriage was pragmatic and functional, a pooling of labor and resources necessary for survival, where a couple came together to manage a strip of land or a workshop, making love not just irrelevant, but often a highly suspicious emotion that might indicate poor financial judgment or dangerous, uncontrolled passion, cementing the terrifying truth that for most of the Middle Ages, marriage was less about "I do" and more about "I own." This cold, financial approach to the family unit was powerfully reinforced by the most pervasive, suffocating force in medieval life: the Church's relentless, centuries-long war on sexual pleasure, a twisted theology that turned basic human desire into a demonic conspiracy. Far from simply frowning upon pleasure, the medieval Church, driven by the teachings of early theologians like St. Augustine, who saw all sexual activity as inherently contaminated by original sin, essentially declared total psychological war on the human body, preaching that the pleasure felt during intercourse was the proof of humanity's fallen state, a demonic echo of the Garden of Eden. The dogma was clear: to enjoy sex, even with one's lawful spouse and for the purpose of procreation, was a venial sin, because the pleasure itself indicated a lack of control, a brief surrender to the devilish lure of the flesh, forcing married couples to approach the most intimate of acts with an attitude of grim, medicinal obligation, advised to render the debt quickly and without enthusiasm, followed by an appropriate, sanctified feeling of guilt and shame. This fear of pleasure led to the creation of the infamous penitentials, detailed lists and handbooks for priests that categorized and assigned penances for every conceivable sexual act, often specifying that any non-procreative position or any act that induced too much pleasure was a deadly sin, a terrifying, legalistic framework that made intimacy a minefield of potential damnation. Furthermore, the Church aggressively restricted the timing of sexual activity, establishing an exhaustive calendar of abstinence that included Sundays, all major feast days, the entire 40 days of Lent, the 40 days of Advent, every Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday in some areas, during a woman's menstrual period, during pregnancy, and while breastfeeding, a list so extensive that theologians calculated it left married couples with barely 60 to 70 days, a year when sex was theoretically permissible, and even then, it had to be joyless. But the cruelest aspect of this theological framework was its relentless focus on women, who were taught to be the inherently lustful, more carnal sex, the biological trap set by the devil to drag righteous men into hell. forcing women to carry the dual burden of being simultaneously blamed for men's desires, while being condemned and punished for having any of their own, ensuring that marriage was not a celebration of love, but a strictly controlled damage control system designed to contain and suppress the evil of human sexuality within the narrowest possible social boundaries, with the highest moral praise always reserved for the state of celibacy and perpetual virginity. If love wasn't about sex or emotion, what was it about? For medieval men, it was often about violence as a romantic gesture, a brutal expression of dominance and conquest that society not only accepted but enthusiastically celebrated. In the medieval mind, a man proved his devotion and worth by his capacity for aggression, risk, and physical domination, transforming acts that modern society defines as felony crimes into the highest expressions of passion. Medieval literature, from the Chansons Digest to the later romances, is filled with tales of raptus, the abduction and forceful carrying off of a woman, which was regularly portrayed not as a terrifying crime of sexual violence and kidnapping, but as the ultimate, passionate, romantic adventure, where the man proved his powerful desire by being willing to risk life and limb to snatch his beloved, as if a woman's opinion on the matter was as relevant as the temperature of the moat. The violent spectacle of the tournament was the grand stage for this romantic theater, where knights pounded each other into concussed meatloaf, fighting less for generic honor and more for the public adoration of the watching ladies, especially the one who had granted him a token, a scarf, a sleeve, or a ribbon to be worn into battle, transforming the risk of brutal, often fatal injury into an elaborate courtship ritual where the bloodier the spectacle, the more genuine the man's devotion was considered to be. This philosophy of proving love through violence extended far beyond the jousting list, permeating the legal and social structure of the household itself, where the husband was legally granted the right to chastise or physically beat his wife for infractions. A brutal legal codification of male dominance that defined the marital relationship as one of inherent superiority and subjugation, ensuring that medieval romance was inextricably linked to the capacity for control and brutality. The pervasive societal message, drilled into both genders through literature and cultural example, was clear and terrifying. Violent, aggressive, dominant men were the premium dating material, while a gentle, peaceful man was portrayed as weak, cowardly, and sexually unappealing, thereby conditioning women to find their own oppression and the physical risk associated with their male partners to be the most compelling signs of true, devoted love. This pervasive culture of dominance leads us to the heart of the matter, the system of women as property, prize, and perpetual minor. A legal and social reality that the medieval romantic system was merely the gilded packaging for. In medieval law, women did not exist as independent legal entities. They were perpetual minors under the control of a man, moving from the mund or guardianship of their father or brother to the mund of their husband, unable to own property, make a contract, or even testify in court without a male relative's permission. A reality that rendered the modern concept of choosing your own partner completely unimaginable. Women were literally the prizes in the male competitions of the tournament field and the political games of the court, collected like rare coins or valuable hunting trophies, with the language used to describe the winning of a wife being identical to the language used for acquiring land or livestock. Men won them, conquered them, or claimed them. The language of romance, the soaring poetry, the devoted services, deeply deceptive, because a close reading reveals that the vocabulary is often the exact same as that found in property deeds and feudal contracts, subtly blurring the line between passion and possession. This proprietary view was most starkly revealed in the adultery laws, where a woman who cheated on her husband was not seen as having committed an emotional betrayal against him, but as having enabled an act of theft against his property, a literal stealing of his chattel. with the legal penalties for the man often focusing on compensating the husband for the loss of his possession, while the woman herself faced savage punishment, up to and including being abandoned, mutilated, or sometimes killed by the wronged husband, whose honor was measured by his capacity to defend his property. Even the ultimate romantic fantasy promoted in the literature, that of a hero capturing a woman from an enemy during a raid or war, was celebrated, with the expectation that the traumatized captive would naturally fall in love with her kidnapper, a pervasive, chilling narrative that defined romantic success as the ability to acquire and retain possession of a woman by force. Finally, the medieval understanding of love reached its most melodramatic and fatalistic crescendo in the belief of death. Before dishonor, the triumph of the tragic. Medieval people were utterly obsessed with tragic love stories, and the twisted part is that they genuinely believed that dying for love was morally and romantically superior to actually living happily ever after, transforming death from the enemy of romance into its ultimate, glorious goal. The most celebrated and influential love narratives of the entire age, the legendary, endlessly recycled stories of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, and the historical account of Abelard and Heloise, all end not in a wedding, but in destruction, insanity, or a lifelong, crippling separation, with these failures held up as the perfect examples of what true, transcendent love should look like. The message sent by the cultural elite to the public was brutally clear. If your love story does not culminate in mutual destruction, spectacular suffering, or a premature death, then your love is shallow, unworthy, and belongs to the peasants. A philosophy that encouraged nobles to manufacture dramatic obstacles and engineer their own spectacular romantic disasters, just to prove their passion was as intense as the legendary doomed figures. This belief was so deeply held that the concept of lovesickness, amor heroes, or mal d'amour, was not a metaphor, but a literal, accepted medical condition, described in medical texts from the Salerno School of Medicine onward, believed to be caused by the retention of immoderate thought of the beloved, leading to melancholy, physical wasting, and ultimately, death, with doctors prescribing treatments ranging from bleeding and strong purges to the shocking recommendation that the patient be allowed to sleep with the beloved, if she was willing, as a last-ditch medical cure. Suicide for love was not only acceptable, but romanticized, with literature praising lovers who kill themselves or cause their own destruction as heroes, who chose a noble exit rather than a shallow continuation of life without their beloved, making the perfect medieval love story, one that involved two people bringing about each other's downfall through the sheer, uncontrollable magnitude of their passion, proving that in this dark, twisted age, the ultimate proof of love was not commitment or joy, but complete, total, irreversible annihilation. The medieval heart was a dark and terrifying place, governed not by sentiment, but by property law, religious terror, and the necessity of political survival. We look back at the Middle Ages and see shining armor and fairy tale towers, but beneath that veneer was a system where passion was pathology, marriage was commerce, pleasure was sin, and the highest expression of love was the act of tragic, magnificent self-destruction. This is the truly fascinating and chilling legacy of medieval romance. It reveals that the human drive for connection is so powerful that it will conform to the most hostile, oppressive, and destructive cultural framework, proving that what we call love is less an immutable emotion and more a historical construct, a system of rules created by society, and for centuries, those rules were designed not to nurture happiness, but to enforce control, elevate suffering, and preserve the iron grip of power, leaving us with a final, disturbing question. How many of those ancient, twisted rules, slightly altered but still toxic, still lurk beneath the surface of the romantic stories we tell ourselves today?